Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Rachel Wesson. I am the Events and Communications Specialist at the UC Berkeley Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity, one of the co-sponsors of today's event, Sustainable AI Applications for Good. And it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to the discussion today, which is also brought to you by the Algorithmic Fairness and Opacity Group at UC Berkeley and the CITRIS Policy Lab at the CITRIS and Banatow Institute. Okay, so with that, we are ready to get started, and it is my pleasure to introduce one of our co-moderators for today's discussion, Jessica Newman. Jessica is the director of the AI Security Initiative housed at CLTC, and she's also a co-director of the UC Berkeley AI Policy Hub. And I will turn it over to her now to give you a bit more information about those groups and today's event. Jessica, over to you.
Thanks so much, Rachel, and hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for our event on Sustainable AI, Ethical Applications for Good. As Rachel mentioned, this event is co-hosted by the UC Berkeley Algorithmic Fairness and Opacity Group, or AFOG, as well as the Center for Long-Term Cybersecurity and its AI Security Initiative and the CITRIS Policy Lab. So I'm Jessica Newman. I'm the director of the AI Security Initiative and co-director of the UC Berkeley AI Policy Hub and AFOG. I'm also joined by my co-director, Brandy Noneke. So Brandy, can you quickly introduce yourself?
Yeah, happily. I'm Brandy Noneke. I direct the CITRIS Policy Lab, and I'm also an associate research professor at the Goldman School of Public Policy and a faculty co-director at the Berkeley Center for Law and Technology at Berkeley Law.
Thanks, Brandy. So for those of you who may not be familiar with AFOG, let me just share a little bit of background about the group. So the Algorithmic Fairness and Opacity Group, or AFOG, is an interdisciplinary research group housed at the UC Berkeley School of Information, bringing together faculty, postdocs, and graduate students from information studies, sociology, law, communication, media studies, computer science, and the humanities, among others. We conduct research, education, develop policy, build systems, bring theory into practice, and bridge disciplinary boundaries. Throughout our efforts, we center human values in the design and use of technical systems to support more equitable and just societies. So as you may know, AFOG was founded and led by Professors Deirdre Mulligan and Nilüfer Salehi, but Brandy and I are happy to be filling in while Deirdre is temporarily on leave, serving as the Deputy U.S. Chief Technology Officer for Policy in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy. It's our honor to support this incredible community while she leads such impactful work. So AFOG is an open community, and we welcome all students, faculty, and staff at UC Berkeley, as well as those beyond campus, to take part in our events. So please do subscribe to the AFOG listserv if you're not already. You can find that at the bottom of the AFOG homepage, which is afog.berkeley.edu. And so with that, let's dive into our event today. I am really thrilled to introduce our three esteemed speakers. We have Lydia Gaby, who is a principal at HR&A Advisors and a leading expert in equitable economic development. Her expertise lies in creating strategies that foster wealth creation while addressing racial and climate disparities. Lydia offers profound insights into the impact of technologies, policies, and investments on communities and their economies. She's known for her expertise in crafting ethical corporate and government strategies grounded in community priorities and supported by community-validated data. Lydia's extensive experience uniquely positions her to collaborate with communities, empowering them to advocate for and lead transformative change that enhances lives. Krishnaram Kenthapadi is the Chief AI Officer and Chief Scientist of Fiddler AI, an enterprise startup building a responsible AI and ML monitoring platform. Previously, he was a principal scientist at Amazon AWS AI, where he led the fairness, explainability, privacy, and model understanding initiatives in the Amazon AI platform. Prior to joining Amazon, he led similar efforts at the LinkedIn AI team and served as LinkedIn's representative in Microsoft's AI and Ethics in Engineering and Research, or ETHER, advisory board. He's published more than 50 papers and filed more than 150 patents. He's presented tutorials on privacy, fairness, explainable AI, model monitoring, responsible AI, and generative AI at forums such as ICML, FACT, and AAAI, and instructed a course on responsible AI at Stanford. Jared Lewis is a public policy entrepreneur specializing in digital access and sustainable economies. He currently serves as head of policy for Dentsu Good, a sustainability accelerator, where he is helping to shape digital-first circular economy projects in partnership with some of the world's largest corporations. Previously, Jared worked as a director with HR&A and as a global program manager for Airbnb, where he led a global user education and mobilization program in 9 countries. Jared was the inaugural Congressman John Lewis Social Justice Fellow for Science and Technology, where he worked for 2 members of Congress on a range of technology initiatives, and is a current Tech Policy Fellow at UC Berkeley. So thank you all for joining us today. Really thrilled to have you here. And now let me pass it over to Jared to begin the presentation.
Thank you so much, Jessica. And you'd think I would understand how to unmute at this point, but it is a challenge every time. We're super excited to be here. As Jessica mentioned, my name is Jared Lewis, and I currently work at Dentsu Good, but I'm also a part of the Berkeley CITRIS Lab Professional Tech program. But before we get started, I wanted to talk a bit about, how we got to this point. In my role at Dentsu, I really focus on cultivating public-private partnerships that help our mission of accelerating more sustainable industry. And we rely heavily on the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals in trying to cultivate these public-private partnerships. So I joined the Berkeley Fellowship because I wanted to learn a little bit more about the relationship between emerging AI and the private sector, and the role that the private sector could play in ensuring that there is a more ethical expansion of these emerging technologies. And during this time, we've been able to collaborate with wonderful stakeholders, both inside the fellowship and inside of industry, throughout industry, and have developed a series of initiatives and proposals around creating more ethical and sustainable AI. So let's start a bit with the problem. The problem is that the AI rate of adoption is much steeper than other technologies. And so when you look at over a 4-year time horizon, the rate at which AI has been adopted versus, let's say, cell phones, it's almost double the rate. But at the same time, as that rate of adoption, AI presents a range of risks and challenges. And so as we think about the best way to use this technology for society, for industry, we have to also weigh that against the range of risks that are coupled with the use of that technology.
I wanted to jump in here just to add a couple of words on some of the other risks as well that we can call out. So as was mentioned earlier, my name is Lydia Gaby. Hi, everyone. I'm a strategic planner and a consultant focused on economic development. So what I study and advise on is how we can improve quality of life from a socioeconomic perspective. We think about things like the fast rate of adoption for AI technologies. What are the risks that that carries for communities? And I'll talk specifically about a couple of the risks that are shown on the slide right here: job loss and economic transition or displacement, and data bias. So after COVID, there was a lot of concern about job loss and the impacts of things like remote work on the knowledge economy. And this big question remains still, if a job can be done anywhere, can it also be done by anything? The knowledge economy in particular is hugely at risk. Previously, these kinds of jobs were insulated from the threat of automation, but now we're really on a slippery slope with AI being a big contributing factor. So just what exactly is the knowledge economy? It's things like data analysis, preliminary research, creative writing, copy editing, visualization. Even some tasks like decision-making are all being more automated or augmented by artificial intelligence. And so without really careful study and policy, the use of AI will only exacerbate the socioeconomic divide. And so what that means from an economic sense is that a small number of elite staff elements of the workforce who have the ability to use AI will have control over those kinds of systems. A large portion of the population would be locked out of those jobs. And we've never really been good as a country, as a world, at restructuring systemically our economies to support those kinds of transitions, to support those who are no longer able to serve those job functions and need to be, involved elsewhere in the economy. So as a result, often you see long-term unemployment, population loss as people move away to more affordable areas, and lots of other socioeconomic impacts. So these are some of the things that we think about when we talk about the impact on the socioeconomics of our communities. And ultimately, we're actually worse off for these kinds of decisions because there's something that AI lacks, which is the power of nuanced judgment that's based in the human experience. And so even while AI can process data and information, it can make recommendations, it doesn't understand essence of human behavior, culture, emotions, and all the variables that shape our world, that shape our economies. And so a lot of the quality and the outcomes of the work actually suffer with this being a major driving force behind automation in those particular job functions, particularly this early on in our adoption of AI technology. So that's one of the risks, is the displacement of people from jobs because of automation and because of the use of AI technology. The second risk I'll just speak on briefly, we see it down here below. The second icon is data bias. So as organizations increasingly lean on AI for decision-making, we risk a world where our decisions lack that human judgment, that human observability. We're going to talk a little bit more about that as we go further in the presentation. But the question is, can AI truly understand the impacts of its recommendations on our societal fabric, on health and well-being, on the subtleties of our cultural context? No, not really. And so when we think of AI, oftentimes people perceive AI as something that is objective or neutral. But these kinds of systems are trained on the data that we give them, and the data that we give them is often riddled with historical bias and inequality in and of itself. And so when that's the case, AI systems can, will, and do perpetuate and amplify systemic bias. So I'll give you a couple of examples. For one example, AI trained on past hiring decisions might systemically undervalue candidates from marginalized backgrounds. So that reinforces barriers for those who are or aren't able to access good jobs. The implications of this kind of systemic reinforcement of bias are wide-ranging. It can impact things like credit scores, hiring processes. It can create disparity in healthcare recommendations, over-policing for communities of color, differential access to mortgages or business loans. If we allow corporations and organizations to adopt AI to accelerate their work, especially without that human observability element, we run the risk of that kind of systemic bias only being more amplified and further entrenching the prejudice and differential access to opportunity that we're seeing across our community today. So I'll pause there, but just wanted to talk a little bit about the economic impacts of artificial intelligence that we're seeing so far.
So just to add to what Lydia and Jared highlighted, I also want to share that any new technology brings a number of challenges and also opportunities. So even with aspects like job loss and economic transition, things may not necessarily be as bad as we may think. Like just as any new technology, including AI, or more specifically, say generative AI, introduces a number of disruptions, there may also be new opportunities that may be created. You may have seen a recent article that came out maybe a month back or so, where a study showed that those who leverage the AI tools are able to perform much better than those who do not leverage the AI tools. And kind of the insightful part, even in this study that I just shared here, is that there is a sentiment that AI can even work as a skill leveler, in the sense that those who are really bad at doing certain tasks were able to get a lot more benefit of using the AI tool compared to those who were already pretty good at that. So the author in this study makes the analogy with miners back in the time of Industrial Revolution, where it used to matter whether miners were good or bad at digging through rock until the steam shovel was invented and played as a now the differences in digging ability did not matter anymore. So there are also positive aspects with AI tools. The challenge is, how do we ensure that these kinds of tools are used to augment the human ability as opposed to displace humans, as Lydia was mentioning. So I think that's the real challenge. Very recently, I heard Professor Eric Brynjolfsson comment that AI may not necessarily displace a job entirely, but it might help automate some of the mundane parts of any job. And different jobs have different levels of those kinds of mundane tasks. The challenge is, how do we as a society create the appropriate incentives, appropriate regulations, and so forth to ensure that these AI tools help augment human ability as opposed to displace jobs. I think that's going to be a big challenge as we start having more and more of these kinds of tools. The other challenge I often think about is, if indeed it so happens that the AI tools end up creating lots of disruptions, the country and end up channeling or siphoning a lot of the GDP or revenue to a few tech companies which are developing these tools. What is the role of government to reduce the level of inequity? This was a comment that I remember reading in an article several years back by Kai-Fu Lee titled "The Real Threat of Artificial Intelligence." This was almost 6 years back, and in that article he talks about how a few tech companies based in US and China are developing most of the AI related technologies. And back then he had the premise that it might end up creating a lot of economic disruption. But these two countries could afford to change their taxation policies to heavily tax even those companies which are benefiting disproportionately. And he was asking the rhetorical question as to, what about the rest of the world? What about places where there may not be strong AI or technology companies, whether it is Africa or parts of Asia, India, and elsewhere? Again, I think these are kind of challenges that we are going to grapple with, either at an entire society level or even at a per country level. Even within US, how do we create incentives for more equitable development across all regions? I think these are going to be challenges. And more to the technical challenges, just like previous machine learning technologies, even the new wave of technologies are introducing a number of issues, whether it's related to bias, as Lydia was referring to, or privacy or intellectual property and so forth. Some of the challenges are a lot amplified with predictive AI models such as classification or regression models. Often the training data was limited, and you could do extensive audit of these training data to understand what may be the kinds of biases, what may be the mechanisms to mitigate those biases, and so forth. The challenge with large language models or other generative AI models is that even the amount of training data is so large, perhaps the entire internet or the corpus of entire books and so forth. And that makes even auditing for such biases very challenging, let alone even anticipating what may be different kinds of biases that might exist in the data. I think these are some of the kind of challenges that we are already having to deal with, even as we start seeing more and more adoption of these kinds of technologies. The same applies for privacy or even intellectual property or copyright implications. There is a sense that many of the copyright laws that we have today were not quite designed to handle the gray area that many of the generative AI technologies are leading us towards. And these are again challenges that we will need to grapple with. So I'll let Jared share more on some of the similar questions and challenges.
Yeah, thanks, Krishnaram. And I think that first point is really where we begin to narrow, which is about sort of the potential economic and social loss in the transition. And so much, after a range of discussions with, again, various stakeholders, we've landed on that we perhaps should start shifting the conversation or evolving the conversation from risks to values. And so we came up with this proposition, which is sustainable AI. And what we're saying is that sustainable AI is about merging social values with ethical AI design to accelerate both practical applications, but the purpose is to center long-term prosperity of people and planet in the evolving human-to-machine interaction. And so what this means is that as we choose where to apply this technology, as we choose what problems to solve, that we don't just focus exclusively on those that bring economic value or efficiency to organizations, but those that bring other forms of social and economic values to society. And that really the UN SDGs are a way to provide that guiding principle. So I'll pause there because we have more on this in just a moment, but we really think that there are three simple questions that you can center in sort of starting this conversation. And I would toss it over to Lydia to speak a bit more about that.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. These three simple questions, in our efforts to define this term, these are one of the ways that we're keeping ourselves grounded. And without a clear yes to all three of these questions, we really have to ask ourselves if this is the best and most responsible use of AI or sustainable use of AI. So the questions are on the bottom here. Does the application give the users agency in choosing when, how, and where to engage in the technology? If this is not transparent and clear to them, they don't have agency over its use. It might not be sustainable AI use case. Does the application seek to solve a fundamental human or environmental challenge? And does the application of AI cause social or environmental risk or harm? I also want to say that answering these questions is not a simple task. So a lot of the work is actually designing new methods to see and feel the risk and harm associated with these kind of applications and bringing that information closer to those who are designing and adopting the technology so that they can make more informed decisions.
So the good news is that there's already a frame to think about sort of this value proposition. We'll call it the social value proposition. On one hand, we have global leadership that exists around where corporations and organizations should target investment in order to create opportunities that both are prosperous for organizations and for society at large. On the other hand, the growth of investment in AI has ballooned, and over the last roughly 5 years, from 12 billion globally to about 91 billion globally. So looking at both of these vantage points simultaneously, we arrive at, if we think about AI as in the way that we're investing AI through the lens of these goals, we might be able to achieve a balanced growth in the technology. And so what we're seeing on the right is companies that are the largest tend to have existing initiatives within the UN Sustainable Development Goals. And there are three areas that are most represented. They are climate change, it's decent work and economic growth, and it's health and well-being. And sort of ironically, all three of those are represented in terms of the transition risk and the risk associated with rapid AI adoption. So we suggest that corporate social responsibility, environmental social governance, and sustainability provide a frame to think about where to target AI development that both serves organizations in the private sector as well as society at large.
So here, the question is, how can we move forward with that kind of frame, with the supports and resources for those organizations who are adopting AI? And on the left-hand side here, you see that we identified 3 goals. First, uplifting applications that improve human prosperity, identifying ways that these technologies can improve quality of life and not just the bottom line. Second is, create a public understanding of AI mechanics to empower public choice in the appropriate uses of AI. We're going to get to that more in a moment, but really important to have a better widespread understanding of AI and its implications. And then third here, create frameworks that prevent risky and harmful applications of AI. This might be calling out the harm of specific applications that don't include things like human observability, transparency, or that simply weren't designed with people and well-being at the center. So I'll pass it back over to Jared to talk about what we have on the right-hand slide here about some of the interventions that we've been exploring along these lines.
Yeah, and so in having, a range of discussions with industry experts and experts in the AI space, we source 5 interventions that, we think could be immediately applicable and could help us build this AI sustainability frame. One is technology that provides transparency into what generative AI and other AI applications are doing. And this intervention is exactly what Fiddler AI is doing and Krishnaram's team. And Krishnaram could speak to that a bit more in just a moment. 2 is licensing and credentialing. We could think of no other industry with such broad, potentially harmful and positive externalities that don't have some form of licensing and credentialing, whether you're talking about architects, engineers, universities themselves, or medical professionals. The third is an AI use index. And so acknowledging that AI will continue to continue to expand and evolve, and it will happen rapidly and much faster than perhaps regulations can adopt to. Having an ability to search quickly an emerging technology, an emerging application, and understanding through that search, understanding through this index, what are the appropriate uses and what uses might pose a range of risks. Next is the layperson's guide to AI. What we found in having a range of discussions is that the average person cannot talk about AI even in an intuitive sense from a technical perspective. And so that creates a challenge because when you're asking regulators, you're asking policymakers, or you're asking individuals and decision makers within organizations to choose, which uses are appropriate or to choose where to invest or to apply, their lack of ability to explain the mechanics of the technology, even in an intuitive sense, is an inherent risk. And so we think that we need to provide a roadmap for the layperson to understand so that we take this discussion out of exclusively the sort of the academic and well-researched space and into the common parlance. And then the final is an AI sustainability stamp. And so thinking about this from a consumer perspective and a user perspective, having an ability to very efficiently and effectively identify whether or not a particular application has at least attempted, but certainly has been effective at reaching a certain threshold of sustainability, which we'll define in just a moment. But what are the risks? What are the harms? And have those concerns been adopted into the design and use of the technology? And one final point here. This actually starts with media in terms of an industry actor. So when you think about industry creating interventions and thinking through sort of what are the most appropriate uses, the more we have these conversations, the more we realize that there is one industry in particular that can have it can be highly effective in changing some of the discourse and in leading in some of these interventions. And there are a few reasons. One is when we think about the transition from analog to digital in terms of the private sector, media was actually a leader in that transition. Many media firms, and when we say media, that includes advertising, that includes sort of more traditional film media, they led in the transition of how consumers in society at large were engaging with technology. And it makes a lot of sense because you're talking about consumers. And so when industry is adopting a new technology, it's doing it from the lens of driving more sales or growing the business or being more effective at delivering goods and services. But there are a couple of other reasons. One is that media actually is a heavy investor in emerging technologies, including AI. So when you think of how the average person interacts with AI in the present tense, many of these interactions are from a media and advertising lens. So for example, there was, this chat robot where you could talk to celebrities, and clearly it was an application. But that is a perfect example of how how sort of a generative AI tool had been used to create this engagement that wasn't really real or authentic, and it was playful, but it was certainly it was just an application that really was to serve a very simple and goofy purpose. Another is that media shapes industry perception of AI capabilities. And so there's a lot of data that the more you believe how AI is depicted in media, the more likely you are to believe things that aren't quite true. So for example, you're less likely to believe that there is surveillance risk with AI, and you're more likely to believe that you can have an intimate and authentic relationship with AI, which perhaps is debatable, but remembering that these are not intelligent technologies. And then the final piece is that media actually influences consumers, which is really important. The reason why media is able to do the work that it does is that it has an understanding of how consumers think and behave. And so when you talk about industry creating technologies that help to increase consumption or help to increase the number of goods or products sold or to engage with society at large, it's actually media that's using insights to make that feasible.
Thanks, Jared. I just wanted to reinforce the point about how media kind of creates this and also reinforces its own narratives about how the technology could be used, how it is being used, and where are the dangers and risks. AI uses these kind of biases to inform how we build out the technology itself, define the use cases, and invest in the foundational infrastructure that we use every day, the algorithms that we interact with every day. So our cultural acceptance of these use cases, what we can imagine for the use of the technology, these are all heavily influenced by science fiction, the applications that we might be using already, and portrayals in the media. And I approach this from an analytics perspective because we do things in the economic sense where we're analyzing markets. And companies are using market analytics to make decisions about where and how they invest in their product services and how they should use and adopt AI. And when AI itself is informing those analytics, is generating those analytics to reinforce certain narratives, we're only reinforcing the bias that comes from the data that was then, shared with those audiences to form their perception. So all that's to say is that it's really important that we build a broader public understanding of AI beyond what might be sort of served up to consumer audiences through some of these common portrayals that you're seeing in the images here from the media industry. And the way that we talk about AI will help to make sure that the way that we're investing in AI is supportive of our fundamental needs rather than just the kind of applications and use cases that we see that are very cool in the media and the technologies that we see in the applications we're seeing today.
So to perhaps elaborate on what we mean by AI sustainability stamp, we would ideally like to address different dimensions, starting with, say, some of the technical dimensions. So that the technical dimensions could include not only how well does the AI system perform as a whole in terms of accuracy, precision, or similar metrics, but how well does it perform for different subgroups? How robust is the AI technology to maybe minor changes or to adversarial attacks? To what extent does it protect the privacy of different stakeholders, whether privacy of users whose data was used to train the model, or maybe privacy of those who are querying the model, and so forth? To what extent is the model explainable to users with different levels of technical knowledge? Does the system provide human understandable explanations to the end users? Does the system have the ability for data scientists or other technical stakeholders to understand when the model might be making mistakes? Do we know a good sense of the failure modes of the system? In many settings, we may not be deploying an AI system by itself, but instead using that in conjunction with human experts. So what's important is not that the AI system is perfect. Instead, we need to understand when we can trust the AI system and when we should defer to domain experts instead. So in that sense, understanding when the system can be relied upon or not is extremely important. Then there are also broader application level risks, whether it's around what are the potential environmental risks or either known or foreseeable risks for say our economy or for jobs, humanity as a whole, and so forth. And likewise, what are some of the application related harms, and how do we go about both anticipating the different types of harms and proactively incorporating mechanisms to reduce such harms. For example, if we anticipate that a technology could be used towards purposes like misinformation or disinformation, can we incorporate tools to either measure such disinformation or misinformation, or even tools to minimize the usage of the technology for such undesirable purposes? So these are all some of the challenges. We don't want to claim that we have the solutions for all of this. We have a reasonably good understanding of on the technical side, as Jared mentioned earlier. These are the kinds of tools that organizations like Fiddler and several others have been building towards. But I would say on the application or on the harm side, we have some understanding, but we need to devise a lot more ways for quantifying this, for even understanding the qualitative effects of this. So this is again like a work that I would encourage all of the folks attending this session to be part of.
Thank you. And with that, I mean, our intention is to continue building this working group. We've put a lot of time and effort thinking through the range of challenges and the abundance of opportunities. And we want to drive towards really building out those 5 interventions that we mentioned. And so we believe it begins with the AI for the layperson explainer thought leadership piece. And so we're working diligently on producing that article. And then we also would welcome everyone in this room and those who are listening to the recording after this event to reach out if there's any interest in supporting with the cultivation of an AI sustainability stamp. We think that could be hugely transformational in providing a really simple tool, really effective in the way that we have seen safety standards on products, or have seen the B Corp stamps, and being able to tell a user what the organization or what the application has done to ensure that it is reducing risk and preventing harm. So with that, I think we're going to step back and open up, toss it back to Jess.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. I think the framing of sustainable AI is exciting and important. So we're going to shortly open it up for audience Q&A. And so for people in the audience, if you have questions you haven't put in the Q&A function, go ahead and do that now. Prior to that, we'll just start off with a couple of questions for all 3 of the speakers. So first, what is one thing you believe companies must consider as they adopt AI technologies? And secondly, what is one thing that the average person must know, which if they did know, might change the way that AI is being adopted by corporations and governments?
Thanks, Jessica. I'll just quickly answer from my perspective. I think one thing that companies must consider is who is harmed by this use of AI. This is a particular kind of analysis that is often not performed. We're all really excited by the benefits of the kind of application, but if we take a moment before adopting the technology in that way to analyze what could be the possible use cases and externalities from that use case, who would be harmed by that decision, then we can take specific measures to mitigate against those harms, rather than sort of addressing those on the back end. And from the average person's standpoint, I think what I would encourage everyone to think about or to know that if you relinquish your rights, if you release the power that you have to require that kind of accountability, that kind of responsibility, you might not get that chance back. I personally am here based in Los Angeles, and we just sort of are still witnessing the impacts of this kind of discussion around the use of AI in the entertainment industry. That isn't to say that AI can't hugely help the creative industry and the entertainment industry, but the rapid adoption without sufficient protections for those who are powering the creative industry, that really opens up a lot of risk and harm to them, their intellectual property, and ultimately, would do damage to the creative work that they all want to contribute to. So it isn't about saying no, it's about supporting companies, organizations, systems in making, taking those steps forward with consideration to the impacts that they might have and how to move forward with people, with humans, and well-being at the center.
If I were to add some thoughts, like regarding what should companies do, I think that we need to create the right incentives at different levels. It doesn't work for, say, the leader at a company, let's say a CEO, to say that we want to adopt responsible AI and so forth, but not follow that up with concrete actions. Today, the reality is that data scientists or machine learning engineers at many tech companies are incentivized when they provide business metric improvements, but they may not get as much incentives, or they may not get as much visibility if they detect biases or privacy or other issues with the systems. So we need to change the incentives at all levels, starting from the employees, teams, at a company level, and more broadly at a society level. I think we need to craft or have the right set of regulations, regulations that can evolve over time as the needs change. And I think we need incentives at different levels. In terms of what we can do to improve the perception of AI as a whole, I often feel that different societies seem to have different levels of optimism around AI. I was at a conference related to industrial AI last week, and one of the speakers mentioned that the optimism on AI in lesser developed regions in the world is very high, which was a little bit counterintuitive. That may be partly because we are seeing these new AI technologies affect the knowledge workforce, which is which may be a large fraction of countries like US are working on. But if you look at applications in other sectors, I'm a lot more optimistic. In industrial AI and other domains, AI has a huge potential. I think we need to highlight the risks with AI. At the same time, we should not shy away from the huge benefits that AI can bring about.
Yeah, I don't have as eloquent of a response as Krishnaram and Lydia, but I would say on the first question about what companies should consider, I would just note that companies have been adopting what we might consider AI for 20 years in creating efficient operations. And I think it's the most recent innovations, particularly around generative and these large language models that are creating all of this interest. But when you kind of start with that, you realize that the risks are really broader than AI itself, and it has to do with the footprint of organizations and of companies. And I just think that companies really should take seriously and have and understand that they do have a footprint in the world, and AI poses, a moment where that footprint might rapidly expand. And if the footprint is more harmful than it is beneficial, then we will expand harmful outcomes. And then in terms of society at large, I just think, what I would like everyone to know is that artificial intelligence isn't intelligent. And so it isn't sentient. It isn't smart. It doesn't think on its own. It is a calculator. It's the best way I could put it. And so who's putting in the calculations? And you should always be asking yourself that.
Okay, great. Thank you both so much for answering those two questions. I've been monitoring the Q&A, and the first question that I want to pose is from Genevieve Smith, because it gets at, I think, a really important point that we're seeing in sort of this pushback against regulation and governance and checks on generative AI or black box models. So Genevieve's question is, I've heard arguments from folks that humans are, quote, black boxes too, seemingly in defense of using machine learning tech that are black box by saying they both have these features. I'm curious how the panelists would respond to this type of argument. What are the risks of this particular mindset or approach, especially over time as machine learning tools are used for different decisions?
I have a thought, which is that yes, but people individually, I guess, don't, if I'm understanding the question correctly, people individually don't run entire systems. And what we're doing potentially is handing over operational questions to a machine, to, again, a calculator. And so that's now creating its own calculations that we can't follow. Usually in human systems, there are ways to intervene, or there are checks, or at least in theory, there are some sort of check and balance and some way to prevent the most harmful outcomes, or to reverse it because you're dealing with other humans. In this case, we may be handing the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, over to something that we can't really observe what's going on.
Yeah, so it's all about the power of the decision making that really it's unchecked by one entity. Lydia?
Yeah. Just to add on to that, in some of my work, we analyze systemic bias, and a lot of the systemic bias that we see in our current society was created by people. It was created by people, and it's codified by policies and protocols that people operate on. But to reinforce something that Jared said, people are operating within systems where we can stop at a moment to say, okay, the law requires that after this decision has been made, we're going to audit the impacts. And, someone can be held accountable. I can't hold a generative model accountable at different points. There's no real legal precedent for that. So I don't necessarily disagree that people and humans, and the way that they apply their own biases, that it isn't its own little black box, but people have their own human limitations to what they can do, what they can compute, and how much they can control within the systems that are creating these kind of outcomes. And because of those human limitations, the system of decision-making moves slower. It creates more opportunity for us to intervene and to understand what that person is doing, to replace that person in a way that we can't often audit and systemically remove that kind of bias when the system itself is only, purely digital, or is that kind of digital calculator we were talking about.
Yeah, and actually I have two questions for a follow-up on this. First, I loved in the presentation, Jared, when you said, let's focus instead of on risk, let's transition to values in this social value proposition. We're at a lot of the framing right now. And if we also tie this to your point about the use of media, there's so much hype around AI, whether it's dystopian or utopian, dystopian of headlines, robots replacing workers and the death of creativity, to the utopian of AI is going to be that silver bullet that allows us to address all of society's ills. But it's more about how can we communicate the true value, and what do you think we need to do in the governance space? And this is a question for all three of you. In the governance space, how can we recalibrate that to better ensure that, okay, sure, yes, we are identifying and mitigating risks, but we're also thinking about how are we maximizing the benefit of this transformative technology for society?
Krishnaram, do you want to take it? Lydia and I took over the last question.
Yes, I think like often I also find myself seeing both this kind of utopian and dystopian views. Like I tend to gravitate more towards the middle ground, and at least like I read the perspectives from both sides to get a feel for right, what are the different perspectives. And again, like as I was alluding to earlier, like we may not necessarily want to completely stop a new technology because of all the real risks as we discussed today. There is also sometimes a sentiment that the only way to understand new risks is to gradually, in a very paced manner, deploy new technology. In fact, this is what I saw even advocated in the link that I just shared a few minutes back. This was advocated in by some of by Vinod Khosla, who is an entrepreneur in one of the generative AI forums, saying that if we wait before starting to deploy new technologies, we may never understand any real risks. The key challenge is how to gradually deploy, learn from the mistakes, and make sure that we have a good understanding of what is the extent of potential damage that can be caused. So I'll just leave it at that.
And Lydia, I see that you've unmuted, so I'll give you a moment to make a point on that. But then I think my the final question is going to tie a nice bow around this discussion we're having. Go ahead.
Yeah. I come at this from a very optimistic space, actually, where I think that there are a lot of risks and harms, but there's so much potential around the use cases and the utility of AI to improve the quality of human life. What's often missing is a vision about what is the life that we're trying to create, what is the society that we're trying to create, because having that holistic perspective that allows you to personalize those externalities that if we don't care for, we're pushing people out of our current system without really a plan. People in, the dawn of the Industrial Revolution talked a lot about safety nets. When we have gone, as the American economy went through its great recessions, we talked about how not having a vision for what is the life that we, hope our economy to support creates this pathway for people to fall out of our systems and our economies, and really reduces quality of life. So if we think about what is that future economy, then we aren't relying on, that person might be out of a job, but they'll find another job somewhere else. We don't have to rely on the system just working as designed. We know that that isn't going to work. But if you have a more holistic vision of, I think that jobs with AI can look like this. This is the importance and the relevance of the human in that kind of system. And then we can design with that picture in mind and account for the kinds of externalities and harms that people have experienced in the past with this new technology, especially if, as Krishnaram was saying, we're adopting slowly to see those harms and address them over time in a gradual way.
Wow, this is really fascinating work, Lydia, and thinking about, all three of you thinking about what is our shared vision of what we actually want in this technology and a society that can benefit from its use. So my final question, and we have a little bit of a tight time here, so I'll request that your remarks be succinct, but talking about this idea of liability, and this ties back to our point of, well, at what point when a machine learning model is deployed, can you efficiently and adequately address these risks? So thinking about liability, how much should companies be liable for the harms done by their products? And of course, liability has been proven to be a very effective mechanism at shaping incentives. If you think about innovation and design, thinking about the automobile industry. So how might we think about liability and incentives to help ensure that the companies are building these tools that maximize toward that, optimal social value?
Yeah, I will cautiously answer this one, or part of it. I think that companies already operate in a domain of risk, and I actually think that many organizations are trying to slow down their use of AI for this very reason. So, without diving too much into the liability portion of this, I just will note that many organizations don't want to be the ones to introduce something that's going to cause a system failure in some way. And so they are thinking about risk, and they are sort of self-intervening. The broader question about how maybe government might approach that's a challenge. We've talked a lot about what's going on in the European Union, how even those initiatives have not necessarily been the most effective, or time will tell. And then even, in the United States, there has not been as much momentum as one might hope. Probably there'll be some things that percolate up through the court system, but you have to have the harm for that to occur, and so that's going to be years out. But I do think companies are thinking about this and are trying to be very cautious about what they do because they don't want to cause those harms.
Thank you. Almost using it as a value proposition.
So I think the question of liability and risk is very real. In fact, enterprises want to understand the level of risk they are taking with any new AI technologies. And the key thing is to make sure that they don't transfer the risk to somebody else, right? As we are seeing in some of the other domains, like self-driving and so forth. Like I think it's important to make sure that companies developing the technologies are held accountable for any risk they introduce, and are asked to quantify those risks and sufficiently account for the potential negative effects of those risks.
Thank you so much. I'm going to pass it to Jess or Rachel.
Thanks, Brandy, and thank you again to all of our panelists here for this fantastic discussion. I am going to take over screen sharing quickly and take us back to a slide with some contact information. So you can all follow up with any of the co-sponsors or Jared and the working group as he specified. So just a big thank you to the audience for joining us today. Thank you, Jared, Lydia, and Krishnaram for a fantastic discussion. And yeah, really appreciate the thoughtful questions that we got throughout the conversation and the audience participation. So before we shut down, here are a few ways that you can get in touch with our speakers, CLTC, our co-sponsors of today's event. As Jared said, if you want to learn more or are interested in learning about the working group, please do jot down his email address and reach out to him directly. And yeah, we've also got some Twitter or X information and our websites for the co-sponsors here. If you haven't already followed us on Twitter/X, please do, and head to our websites where you can sign up for our respective newsletters so that you don't miss future events such as this one and much more coming from each of our organizations. So I'll leave this slide up for just a moment in case folks need to jot down any info. But once again, just another big thank you to our speakers for today and to the audience for joining us. And we'll see you next time. Take care.